Every morning on the wind-swept edge of Wyoming, old Jed Callahan still baked 2 loaves of bread, one to eat and one to place on a plate beside the empty chair. Not because he forgot who once sat there, but because he never got used to losing them. Then one day, when the snow came early, there was a knock at the door, 3 times, soft, as if afraid to stir something long buried. A girl stood there, hair tangled, hands empty, eyes not seeking pity, just a place where no one asked your name. He let her in, said nothing. From that day on, the kitchen had a new sound, the whisper of skirts brushing the floor, but the silence at every meal stayed the same. Folks said nothing ever happened between them. But sometimes, it's the things that don't happen that become the stories no one ever forgets. Out here in the dust and wind of the West, Part 1. 1 loaf left each morning when the northern wind swept across the Ashen Hills. Folks said the dry season in Wyoming had begun. But far down in Cotton Hollow, where wagon wheels no longer echoed, old Jed Callahan didn't care much about seasons anymore. At his age, time was no longer measured by calendars, but by habit. And each morning, he still baked bread. The small kitchen inside the weathered log cabin still held the scent of old yeast, clinging to the cracks in the walls. The iron oven gave off a slow, steady heat, like the heartbeat of someone no longer in a hurry. Jed always rose before dawn. He stoked the fire, mixed the dough by hand, and quietly shaped 2 plump loaves, laying them on a wooden tray stained with time. One was for him, the other no one ate. Not because he forgot, and not because he hoped. Just that, after all these years, he still couldn't bring himself to bake only one. Even though the chair across the square table hadn't been pulled out since the summer his wife passed, Jed still wiped the table each night and set 2 plates. Once the neighbor's daughter came by with a jug of milk and asked casually, "Expecting company, Mr. Callahan?" Jed didn't answer, just poured her a warm drink and turned away. He wasn't waiting for anyone, but he wasn't quite used to being alone either, not after surviving absence for so long that even sorrow had lost its shape. And so the seasons passed. In town, some whispered, Jed might have died, and only a shadow now came to market each morning, trading firewood for butter and bringing home an extra loaf. Jed didn't mind. He didn't need conversation. Only needed the dough to rise, the fire to hold, and the rain to stay light, so he could still dry his wood. That morning began no different. Outside, the first snow fell like salt dust, fine and cold, brushing the fence posts, the barn roof, and the small table by the window where Jed always set down his fresh loaves. He opened the door, letting the wind sweep through the cabin. Not for any reason, just to remind himself a new day had begun, even if no one knew he was still alive. He picked up the old knife and cut into a loaf. The crust split, warm and fragrant from the overnight proofing. The inside was soft, golden. Jed ate slowly, not because it tasted good, but because there wasn't much else to do afterward. The other loaf, he wrapped it in cloth and placed it on the table. The chair opposite remained in place. No one sat there. No one really knew why he kept the ritual. Maybe it was a forgotten promise, or maybe it was the only way he could keep doing something that still meant anything, even if only he knew what that meaning was. In a world as dry and hollow as this, where folks survived more than they lived, sometimes an extra loaf was the only thing keeping the soul from falling apart. And so he baked, not to eat, not to sell, but to remember that once someone had sat across from him, and he had once lived a life that felt whole. That day began with snow and 2 loaves, like every other day. But by sundown, there would be 3 knocks at the door, and after that, the empty chair would no longer be just a place for memory. Part 2. The Girl from the Eastern Trail. The wind changed as dusk slid down the ridge. Snow turned to thin mud clinging to the stone steps outside the cabin. That's when Jed Callahan heard it. 3 knocks. Not hurried. Not loud, not even asking to come in. More like asking if anyone still lived here. He left the porcelain cup soaking in warm water, wiped his hands on the old leather apron, and opened the door. A girl stood there. The wind passed through her as if she weren't solid. Her faded blue dress, a stained white apron, a black scarf loosely tied like it had just been pulled from some long-abandoned pack. Her cheeks were red from cold, but her eyes weren't wet. Just tired. Like someone who'd come a long way and once wished someone would ask nothing at all. "Sorry if this is the wrong time," she said. Her voice was softer than the wind through the wall slats. "It's just, I can cook, if you need someone." Jed looked at her for a few breaths. Didn't raise his voice, didn't frown. He stepped back inside and opened the door wider. She walked into the cabin like someone returning to a place she used to know, though she'd never been here before. She didn't scan the room for a seat, didn't tread lightly. She just stood there, still, in the wood-walled space, scented faintly of bread. Her left hand gripped her right wrist, keeping it close to her body. Jed nodded toward the corner kitchen. "That room's empty. There's a well out back." She nodded once. Didn't ask about pay, didn't ask his name, and he didn't ask hers. He simply returned to the table and poured more water into the iron kettle. By the time the kettle began to bubble and hiss, she had disappeared into the small room behind the shed. That night, Jed baked again. Not because he needed more bread, but because he didn't want her eating the one left behind. He set out a second plate, said nothing. She stepped out, still in her dress, hair pinned back with a wooden clip. They ate in silence. Jed chewed slowly. She ate lightly, used her left hand to cut the bread, kept her right resting still on her thigh. When she cleared the table, she bowed her head slightly, not in gratitude, just to avoid eye contact. Jed watched her leave the room, then poured more hot water and warmed his fingers against the steam, rubbing it across the small crack in the old cup. Outside, the wind still howled through the eaves, but for the first time in years, he didn't hear the empty chair creak in the draft. The next morning, when Jed rose to start the fire, the kitchen door was already open. She had woken before him. The yeast was already mixed. A cloth covered the proofing dough folded neatly. Jed stood for a long while, saying nothing. Then he lit the stove like every day, brewed the coffee, and pushed the other chair closer to the table. No invitation, no expectation, just closer. And from then on, in the cabin where once only the fire crackled and the knife chopped onions, there was a second breath, quiet, weary, but steady. Later, people asked how he could let a stranger live in his home. Jed never answered. Some stories begin with trust, but others, they begin with nothing more than an unlocked door and a warm loaf on the table, as if the one who arrived wasn't a wanderer, but someone who'd been missing far too long. Part 3. The oven, the empty chair, and an unnamed look. The first day passed, then the second, and then a whole week slipped by, unnoticed. She never asked his name again, and he never asked hers. She remained Eliza, a name spoken softer than breath, and to her he was just the man who didn't break silence. The cabin began to carry a new rhythm, not through words, but in things so small no one else would have noticed. The cloth covering the rising dough was folded neater. The breakfast table now had a salt jar set precisely on the newcomer's favored side, and the fire brighter, steadier, as if someone had begun rising even earlier than Jed Callahan. Eliza never stood too close, but she never stayed too far. She worked hard, wiping shelves, stacking firewood, kneading dough, scrubbing floors, each motion deliberate, clean, like she'd learned in a place that allowed no mistakes. She didn't sing, didn't hum, didn't sigh. Each afternoon, after scrubbing the wooden cutting board, she'd sit by the window for a few minutes, not looking at anything, just sitting, back straight, hands resting on her skirt, as if allowing herself to exist in silence, not to serve, not to please. Jed noticed, but said nothing. He was used to people who had survived something. And the first kind of respect was this: don't touch their silence. Dinner was always simple: beans, cornbread, sometimes roasted root vegetables. Jed ate slowly. Eliza took only her share. No more, no less. Once she stood to clear the table before Jed had set down his spoon. His hand still held the cup, eyes still on the bread. She paused, then stepped back. No apology, no explanation. But from that night on, she waited for him to leave the table first. One morning, sunlight swept across the glass. Eliza was pouring coffee. Jed, slicing a fresh loaf, glanced up. Her left hand held the kettle. Her right stayed tucked inside the thick sleeve of her dress. Though the morning was mild, she still wore layers, as if winter hadn't yet left. When she tipped the kettle, her right wrist slipped briefly into view, just enough for Jed to notice a faint swelling, a dusky bruise. Old, but not yet healed. She set the mug down gently and turned away, pulling her sleeve down in a swift motion born from instinct. Jed didn't speak. He only touched the warm mug. Didn't drink, just let the heat settle into his hands. His gaze stayed on the door, but his ears followed the sound of her footsteps, careful, as if afraid of scratching the floorboards. That night, dinner went on as usual. Jed ate slowly. Eliza sat one chair away. Nothing happened, on the surface. But Jed chewed slower than usual, not from hunger, but because he didn't want to be the first to rise. And Eliza, for the first time, didn't rush to clear the table. She waited, hands resting still in her lap. No words, but nothing hidden either. That night the fire burned longer, even though the woodpile was running low, even though he wasn't cold. Jed didn't leave his armchair until the embers had fallen into pale rings of ash. And in the soft crackle of old wood he knew something had shifted, barely, like the first hairline fracture in dry ground, letting through a trickle of water. It wasn't trust, it wasn't forgiveness, but maybe it was the first time someone had poured him coffee without hiding their bruise, and maybe that was enough for tomorrow to feel a little different. Part 4. A sound so soft it didn't want to be remembered. A light rain had begun to fall, the kind of rain the frontier knew well. Quiet, slow, not fierce, but enough to carry a chill through bone. The cabin sat alone among wild grass and sloping hills. The wind curled around the old pines, whispering through the branches. The wooden floor had soaked in the dampness from the night before, slick as if glazed in deer fat. That afternoon, Jed had stayed outside longer than usual, sawing at the back barn door. His eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but his hands remained steady, as if they no longer needed light to know what to do. Inside, the fire still burned. Eliza was lifting the cast-iron skillet off the stove when the handle slipped. The sound wasn't loud, just a soft clack of metal hitting wood. But in a house where even breath felt measured, it cracked through the stillness like a dropped memory. Jed paused, saw still in hand. He tilted his head, didn't rush, and just listened for another beat. No cry, no crash, just the sound of someone kneeling. When he entered, Eliza was already on her knees, hand hovering near the loaf of bread that had rolled off the cutting board. It hadn't broken, just lay there, a little tilted. The round board had spun to one side. She was curled in on herself slightly, her right arm reflexively drawn in, shielding. Her sleeve had pulled up, not on purpose, just a careless motion, but enough to reveal a bruise, faded purple, edged in green, the color of time and silence. Not fresh, not gone, just still there. Jed stood at the doorway, didn't clear his throat, didn't ask. Eliza kept her head down, eyes on the bread. Her hand touched it gently like it was the one at fault. Then she placed it back on the board, slowly, carefully, smoothing its crust, aligning its edge, as if this tiny act of precision was the only way she knew to fix something broken, without hurting anyone else. Jed didn't come closer, but he didn't leave either. He stayed where he was, so his presence wouldn't weigh. That was how men out west said sorry, by staying still. Eliza knew he had seen, and Jed knew she knew, but neither spoke. She turned back to the dough. Her hands trembled slightly as she shaped the loaves, not from fear, but from knowing she had let something show that wasn't meant to. The oven remained warm, but her fingers stiffened as she formed each piece. The dough stuck to her palms, clinging like something that didn't want to let go. Only after Jed had gone quietly out back did she exhale. So soft the embers didn't notice. That evening, dinner was laid out as always. Eliza didn't glance toward the opposite chair. Jed didn't mention what he'd seen, but he ate slower. And when Eliza rose to gather the dishes, she noticed he had added extra wood to the fire. The flames reached higher, casting red light across the log walls, illuminating corners that usually stayed in shadow. She didn't say anything, just watched the fire for a moment longer than usual. Then turned back to the dishes, washing them like nothing had changed. But that night, for the first time, she placed a folded towel beneath the bread tray. No one apologized, no one explained. Just small acts, like placing the bread just so, or adding an extra log to the fire, or waiting 1 minute longer before standing. And sometimes that's all it takes for someone to stop feeling like a possession and start feeling like a person. Even if they still haven't lifted their face, even if they haven't yet spoken their truth. Part 5. Surviving isn't always living. The wind out west wasn't violent, but it knew how to slip through every crack in every door. Jed never slept deeply. A man who's lived alone for years learns to recognize the creak of timber, the pawing of a restless horse, and the one thing that doesn't belong. So when a soft footstep, too light, too careful, passed through the kitchen, he opened his eyes. He heard the back door open slowly, then nothing. Then the soft rustle of fabric. Someone sitting down, not from weariness, but as if needing something to lean on in the dark. Jed rose quietly, draping a thin blanket over his shoulders. He didn't turn on the light, didn't step out. He only cracked the door of his room, just enough to see Eliza's outline, lit faintly by the oven's low flame. She sat still at the table, knees drawn to her chest, a white shawl wrapped tight around her arms, one hand turned over slices of browning apple, old, soft, no longer holding their shape. On the table, the paring knife lay idle, blade dry. Eliza didn't eat, didn't peel more, just kept turning the same slices over and over, as if touching a memory no one had spoken aloud in a long time. Her eyes were lowered, but they weren't seeing what was in front of her. It was the kind of gaze only found in people who'd been left behind too many times. Not bitter, not angry, but unable to believe that any embrace could still be real. Jed stood there for a while, not out of pity, but because something in him recognized it. He too had known a night like that, sitting by the charred frame of a wedding photo, beside a chair no one ever came back to. He didn't step out, and he didn't turn away, just pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and gently shut the door. But before the glow of the fire vanished through the crack, he saw Eliza's hand clenching around a misshapen apple slice, her hand still covered not from fear this time, but from cold, and from not knowing if showing it in the light would be met the same as before. The next morning Jed said nothing, but he left a small tin pot on the table, filled with warm apple cider. She glanced at it once, then gave a slight nod. Didn't say thank you, but as he turned to go, her hand rested on the pot a little longer than usual. And from then on, when the night wind slipped through the seams in the cabin walls, no one turned over apple slices alone anymore, and no one had to tell stories of old nights, as long as someone knew when to stand still. Quietly. Part 6, Those Who Never Ask Can Still Stay. Before the sun crested the eastern ridge, the cabin already smelled of low-burning wood. Jed rose earlier than usual, not from insomnia, but because the silence of last night still lingered in his chest. A silence not uncomfortable, not quite gentle, but real, like walking through a forest after wildfire, seeing nothing but knowing something had burned there once. He stoked the fire, laid flour on the counter, and scribbled a short line on a scrap of old brown paper. Yesterday's loaf didn't rise right. Started early today. No name, no spotlight, just tucked beneath the dough cloth by the oven. Not for Eliza to read, but simply as a way to remain, a way to say, I saw, but I won't ask you to tell. By midday, with the sun casting sharp light across the porch, Jed returned from the stables. His hands were oily, his pants dusted with hoof chalk, his back sagged with age. And yet, something in him walked slower that day. When he opened the kitchen door, he paused. On the table was a loaf, perfectly shaped, crust golden inside, soft and springy. The kind of bread made with steady hands and a balanced fire. There were no words left beside it, but next to the loaf sat a white cloth, wrapped around two smaller pieces tied neatly with twine. Meant to be carried. Jed knew that cloth. It was the same one Eliza used to wrap her hands on cold mornings. She wasn't wearing it today. Instead, it lay folded on the table. Not a thank you, but a reply. He took the bundle out to the barn and placed it in front of the old hen's stall. Not for anyone to eat, just to leave it there. A sign that he'd received her message. Eliza didn't see him do it, but that evening, while sweeping the porch, she quietly swapped the kitchen towel. And for the first time, she chose a reddish-brown one instead of white. No one spoke of the night before. No one mentioned the paper note or the bruise or the apples left uneaten. But from that day on, Jed no longer waited for Eliza to speak before lighting the fire, and Eliza no longer bothered pulling her sleeves so high, moving freely in the kitchen like it was a place she once belonged. And slowly, like spring wind slipping through snow that had not yet melted, two people began to stay, not because one saved the other, but because neither walked away any more. Part 7. The Cat and a Sentence Spoken to No One. Autumn crept into Crosswood without a sound. One morning mist clung to the hills, like deer fat, thick and quiet. The first maple leaves began to fall across the cabin roof, dry and brittle like old biscuits left too long in the tin. Jed Callahan was sweeping the chicken coop when he saw blood. Not much, just a few faint drops smeared in the dirt, but enough to make him stop. Following the small paw prints across the damp ground, he found the cat, the squat calico that liked to stalk sparrows by the creek. She was curled tight in a corner of straw, hind legs swollen, bleeding slightly, likely caught in one of the McConnell boys' rabbit traps. Jed didn't say a word. He knelt and lifted her gently. She didn't yowl, just shivered, as if surprised that a hand had reached for her without swatting her away. In the little shed by the kitchen, Jed laid her down on an old quilt, warm water, clean cloth, steady hands. He tended the wound slowly, no gloves, no hurry, handling her not like flesh, but like something more fragile, maybe trust. Eliza stood at the doorway. She hadn't announced herself, her dress dusted with flour, wooden spoon still in hand. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt, just watched. Her gaze held no shock, no pity, only a stillness, like water, in a well that hadn't been stirred. Jed felt her there, but didn't turn. He just kept wrapping the cat's leg with careful strips of cloth. Hands practiced, like a man who had healed things more complicated than cuts. Then he spoke, not turning, not directing it at anyone, just saying it like breath into the air or to himself. Nothing small deserves to be left behind just because it carries old wounds. Silence. The words weren't answered, but they hung there like winter light sliding through a hole in the roof. Not warm, not gone, and then a small shift. Eliza stepped into the kitchen. For the first time, her sleeves were not pulled down past her wrists. Her right arm, where Bruises once sat, was bare, not shown but no longer hidden. She pulled the tray of bread from the oven, golden, fresh, softly fragrant. She placed it on the table, picked up the serrated knife with her right hand, and sliced the loaf. Nothing different. But Jed, standing by the shed, saw it. Not the bread, but that she no longer feared her hands being seen in the light. The cat stayed in the straw, eyes half closed, no longer flinching. Eliza didn't approach, but that afternoon, while folding napkins, she folded one extra and set it beside the door to the shed. No one mentioned it, no one needed to, but something small had changed. Part 8. The look from a man who wanted nothing that afternoon. The wind shifted. It no longer blew from the canyon, but came from the eastern plains, carrying red dust, dry grass, and the scent of a distant, unfamiliar season. Eliza was hanging aprons on the porch when she froze. She couldn't say why, only that something brushed against her without sound. She turned and saw Jed standing at the cabin window. He didn't move, didn't call. His eyes were fixed on the old gate, where the dirt path led from town to this lonely piece of land. There a man was standing. He didn't knock, didn't take a step forward, just stood there, bathed in dusk, hat low over his face, hands buried in his pockets. The color of his skin was sunburnt, dust-worn, like a scar that wouldn't fade from a land that had bled too long. Eliza froze. Her hand tightened around the apron. She knew that frame, not the face, but the hunch in the back, the limp in the left leg, like a memory crawling out from a fever dream. She wasn't afraid, but in that moment she felt small again, like the night she'd been pushed from a wagon, left on a road no one ever looked back on. Jed opened the door. He didn't bring a gun, didn't carry a stick, only brought himself. Solid as the timber that held the cabin through every winter, he stepped outside, slow, deliberate, and stopped between the porch and the gate. Right where the light split him into shadow and sun. He said nothing, didn't ask, "Who are you?" Didn't say, "Leave." He just stood, like a man protecting a fire from going out. The stranger raised his head, hollowed cheeks, sharp cheekbones, an emptiness in his eyes, and not rage, not remorse, just nothing. He looked at Jed, then toward the house. His gaze brushed across the porch where Eliza had already stepped back inside, hands still trembling. Then he turned away, slow, unhurried, as if he'd only come to confirm that she was really here, and having seen enough, walked away with nothing left to take. No one spoke of it afterward. No tense dinner, no thanks, no tears. But that night, Jed noticed something different. By the fireplace, on the wooden chair where Eliza always left her shawl, There was a pair of gloves, men's gloves, worn leather, brown, a bit too large for her hands. She never wore them again after that. Even when the cold deepened, even when the fire burned low, even when the stove puffed out heat that couldn't chase off the frost, she left her hands bare and baked bread in the first chill of winter, as if to say, I still carry wounds, but I'm no longer hiding them. Outside, the wind shifted once more, software, but this time it carried the scent of something that had been let go. Part 9. Not the one who saved her, but the one who stayed a week past since the man at the gate. No one mentioned him. But the changes lived in the smallest things. The cabin was still quiet, but no longer heavy. Each morning Jed still walked out to the stable, but Eliza, no longer waiting for instruction, was already awake, tending the fire, sweeping the porch, shaking pine needles from the eaves. Once Jed caught her standing by the kitchen window, not looking at anything in particular. Just standing there, arms crossed gently, her face softer somehow, as if listening to the quiet around her, and finding peace in it. That night, dinner was different. Roasted pumpkin with anise seeds, and beside it, a small plate of soft bread. Jed sat down and looked at the plate, not surprised by the flavor or soup, but by the fact that it was the first time she'd made something beyond the basics. He cut a slice, chewed slowly, didn't compliment, didn't ask, just ate until the last bite. Then, as he set his fork down, he said, quiet enough that only the fire might hear, tastes like the South. Eliza paused. Just a second. But it was enough to catch her eyes shift gently. Then she nodded. My mother used to bake it after harvest. Nothing more was said, but when Eliza left the kitchen, Jed walked to the hearth, to the leather-covered chest he hadn't touched in years. He opened it, slowly. Inside, a photo frame, dusted, glass fogged, the wood cracked near the edges. The last photo he had kept, him and his wife, before the fire took half the house, and most of what had mattered in his chest. He didn't wipe the glass, didn't fix the frame. He simply placed it on the mantel beside an old pocket watch and the feather from his first hunt, not to display, not for anyone to admire. Just so that if someone saw it in the morning, they wouldn't have to ask. The next morning, Eliza passed by, paused for just a moment in front of the photo. She didn't speak, didn't touch it, just placed a hand lightly on the wooden table beneath it, a gesture not directed at anyone, but like a quiet greeting for someone no longer there. And that was enough. No one saved anyone in that house. No one demanded stories, just two people, once broken, learning to live beside each other without breaking each other more. Jed still never asked where Eliza came from, and Eliza never asked what Jed had lost in the fire, but each left behind a small silence, like a towel hung quietly by the door, or a halved loaf that needed no dividing, or a morning glance that no longer turned away. Part 10. Sleep no longer leaned against the door. Eliza had once slept curled at the edge of her bed, back to the room, coat still on, even though no one was left to flee from. Each night she locked the door from the inside, not because she feared someone entering, but because she feared she might leave again. Jed had kept the hearth lit every night since his wife died, not out of fear of darkness, but because he didn't know what dreams might come in the dark. Some nights he woke, thinking he heard dishes in the kitchen, a shadow at the door, but it was only wind whistling through the slats and a coat hanging near the frame that shifted like someone about to step in. Keeping the fire lit had been his way of telling the house, I'm still here. Until one morning he walked past the barn and saw Eliza's door, unlocked, slightly open. She was already making tea, her steps no longer careful, her gaze no longer turned away when he entered the room. That same morning, Jed let the fire die sooner than usual. Daylight was enough, and maybe so was the presence of another person. The next day, as he adjusted a saddle, he called gently, "Eliza, come here a moment." She looked up from the flower. He pointed at the saddle straps, then toward the wind. "Tell me where it's blowing from." She frowned, not in frustration, but in concentration. Then she followed the gesture. Jed nodded, no explanation, no lecture. He just let her stand close enough to hear the leather creak, to touch the hardened hoof, to smell the mare's sweat, a scent he called the breath of the earth. That afternoon, Eliza taught Jed how to make bread without a recipe. No measuring, no rules, only hands, eyes, and memory. When he asked how she knew it was right, she just shrugged. "Because my hands remember." Jed said nothing more, but inside he understood. Some things don't need explaining, only sharing. That evening, they ate dinner at the same time. No one cleared the table early. No one waited for the other. No invitation, no awkwardness. Just two bowls set apart just enough. Not too close to suffocate, not too far to feel alone. The clink of spoons on ceramic, the scent of warm broth, the glow of roasted root vegetables, and the fading gold of day touching everything like a whisper. In that moment, neither needed to look at the other to know. They had begun to live with each other, even if neither had ever said the word stay. Part 11. The first winter with someone else baking bread. The night before the snow came, the wind turned colder, damp, needling through every crack in the cabin walls. Jed recognized that wind. It carried a certainty he'd known for years. Snow would fall before the weekend. But this year, he wasn't the only one getting ready. Before dawn, with sunlight still tucked behind the hills, Jed pulled on his coat. The thud of dry boots on the wooden floor echoed like a quiet declaration. A new day had come, or maybe something had changed. He knocked 3 times on the kitchen door, just like Eliza had done that first morning long ago. "Eliza," he said, voice low like coals in a dying fire, "I left the dough out last night, ruined." No answer at first. Then, after a breath, the door opened. Eliza stood there, sleeves rolled high, no longer hiding the faded bruise, no longer folding herself inward as if bracing for blame. She lifted the lid off the bowl beside the hearth. New dough already kneaded, already rising. Perfect, as if someone had been baking this way for a long time. Just never had anyone patient enough to sit down and eat it with her. Jed took the wooden poker and stirred the coals, stacking wood the same way he had for 20 winters. But this time he stepped back, letting Eliza slide the tray into the oven first. No gesture, no instruction. But the rhythm between them had become familiar, as if the cabin had always been meant for 2 and one had simply arrived late. The stove glowed red. Wood crackled like sleeves brushing softly in close quarters. Butter melted into warmth, its sweetness mixing with the scent of damp wool and winter smoke. Neither of them spoke, but their hands moved, adding wood, folding towels, flipping loaves, dusting cinnamon into fresh dough. The space between them wasn't silence anymore. It was shared. Outside, snow began to fall, at first like sifted flour, light and slow, dusting the cabin roof. Then heavier, blanketing the rail fence, the porch steps, and the fresh hoof prints from yesterday's ride. Eliza opened the kitchen window a crack. Snow slipped in, carrying a breath of cold. But she didn't close it. She just stood, watching the valley turn white. The same valley that, when she arrived, had been dry and colorless. Beside her, Jed placed a second chair near the oven. He didn't say, "Sit." He didn't look her way, but Eliza came. She sat naturally, as if that chair had always been there, waiting from a winter long ago. They sat there, beside the oven, beside the season's first loaf. They didn't speak of winters past, But in the quiet between them, there was something warmer than fire, stronger than the roof above them, and softer than fresh bread pulled from the oven. Part 12. Travelers still stop for bread at the fork in the road. A year later, where once there had only been wind and dry stone, a small wooden stand appeared near the fork in the road. It sat at the crossroads, where two dirt paths formed a crooked Y, leading north toward the hills, or south to the town of Crosswood. There was no sign, no name, no wind chimes or prices, just a wooden shelf, sturdy and plain, shaded by old canvas, holding a tray of bread, sometimes golden loaves of wheat, sometimes apple cakes or cornbread, sometimes just a hunk of salted butter wrapped in white cloth, and once in a while, a warm cup of tea left on the corner, waiting for someone too cold to refuse it. No one called it a store, no one claimed who owned it, but travelers, mail riders, old women hauling vegetables, young cowhands on long routes, began to stop. Not once, but every time they passed. First slowing, then pausing, then staying a moment longer. Some left coins beneath the linen, others left apples or sprigs of mint, or simply said, "I come here because no one asks where I've been or where I'm going." One day, an older woman with silver hair and a young child in hand stopped as Eliza arranged bread on the tray. She asked, "How do you make bread that smells like this?" Eliza smiled, not a practiced smile, not the kind worn for courtesy, but the soft kind of someone who hadn't been asked such a thing before. Not a question about ingredients, but a question about home. She didn't answer with a recipe. She handed the child a smaller piece, just right for little hands. The child chewed, then mumbled, "Is there a place to sit here?" Eliza pointed to a wide stump near the stand, clean, dry, catching just enough of the afternoon sun. "Sit," she said. "Anyone can sit here. You don't have to tell your story." From then on, people didn't refer to the place by who ran it. They referred to how it felt. "That place by the fork," they'd say, "the one that smells like home." A drunk, pausing there one day to sip tea, returned a week later, his eyes a shade clearer. A mother stopping her wagon for a crying child stayed long enough to see Eliza quietly wrap a loaf, as if it had been waiting for that child all along. Jed didn't sit near the stand. He stood back, beneath the old cottonwood tree, arms crossed, tall and quiet, watching Eliza hand out bread, watching people come and go. She never mentioned it, never asked. But each morning as she wrapped 2 loaves, one soft, one crusty, she placed them a few inches apart on the tray, not as a display, but as space, for those still unsure whether they belonged. And so people came, not just to eat, but to stay a moment in a place where no one asked, "Where have you been? Where are you headed?" Just light, warm, bread, and a woman who never told her story, but whose hands, when setting down a loaf, seemed to have forgiven the whole world long ago. Part 13. A name never mapped, but known by all. No one ever marked the little stand at the crossroads on any official county map. It wasn't a store, had no license, no address. It wasn't listed on any stage route or trail stop. Just a patch of dirt, a canvas shade, a few stumps to sit on, and the scent of warm bread floating in the wind. Season after season. But Western folk didn't live by paperwork. They traveled by instinct. They remembered roads by feeling. And so people began calling it by a name never written on a sign. The House of 2 Loaves. That name started from something small. Someone once asked Jed while he was cutting wood near the stand, "You bake 2 loaves, but only one person eats?" Jed didn't look up, just answered, slow as smoke, "Some days, 1 loaf is for today. The other's to remember what I lost, and that I'm still here." No one wrote it down, but a week later someone passing through asked, "Hey, is this the place 2 loaves?" The person tending the stand didn't answer, just smiled, then pointed to the tray, still warm. And from then on, the name drifted across the plains like wind over dry grass. Quiet, unannounced, but remembered by all who stopped. No one asked why Eliza stayed, even when men passed by, their eyes drifting to the cabin on the hill before they moved on. Even when whispers surfaced, "She used to be," but no one finished the sentence. Because anyone who'd ever sat at the House of 2 Loaves understood some pasts don't need to be retold. They just need to be carried in the way you bake each morning, in a clean seat, in a glance that asks for nothing. Eliza never wore her old gloves again. She never rolled her sleeves to the elbow, but one day she started wearing aprons in lighter colors. Not ash or gray, and Jed, still a man of few words, began leaving small notes beside the morning bread. Not long letters, just a line or two. Did yesterday's rise work out? Winds shifted today, secure the roof. Bake this one a little crisper if you like. One day she left a single note in reply. I don't need anything else, just keep baking too. Crosswood began to know the House of 2 Loaves as a place no one had to give directions to. Yet everyone could find. A child would beg their mother to pass by just to smell the bread. A weary cowboy would stop, drop a few coins, take a slice, then sit in the shade as if trying to name a thing he'd lost long ago. Some left with nothing but a loaf wrapped in cloth, and the feeling, I still have somewhere I can come back to if I need to. Jed never told Eliza he knew what she'd been through, and Eliza never asked why he always poured 2 cups of tea each morning. But in the cabin on the edge of the hill, each morning brought the sound of the stove crackling, bread rising in the oven, and the silence between them was no longer distance. It was presence. Part 14. A story no one tells, but no one forgets. Once a young woman from the east rode across the high plains and stopped at the House of 2 Loaves for water. She asked Eliza, half curious, half in awe, "Why did you stay?" "With a man who never asked about your past?" Eliza was drying her hands on a white apron. Slowly, not rushed. She didn't meet the woman's eyes, just lifted her face a little. The dappled light through the trees, softening the lines near her eyes. And then she answered, not like someone explaining, but like someone finally letting go of a truth they'd carried a long time. Because he didn't save me. He just stayed. Right when I couldn't leave anymore. No one brought it up again. The woman rode on, but years later they still said, out west, there's a little place where the bread's always warm and the man running it never asks about anything except whether the wind's colder today than yesterday. The House of 2 Loaves still doesn't appear on any government record. No sign, no address, no slogan. Nothing but 2 people who live quietly, as if the bruises of the past never existed, but were never denied, either. Jed never moved the empty chair at the kitchen table, but now Eliza always laid a neatly folded white cloth across it at mealtime. Not because someone might still sit there, but because some absences aren't meant to be filled, only acknowledged. From time to time, those who had once stopped, an old cowboy, a young widow, someone who'd lost a person or a part of themselves, they returned. Not to ask questions, not to talk, but to sit quietly in the warmth of that kitchen, as if speaking with the broken part of themselves, the part that had never fully healed. They didn't explain. They didn't retell. They just sat for a while in a place where once there had been 2 loaves, one to eat and one to remember. No one knows exactly when the House of 2 Loaves became a story. Maybe it was when a man stood in the evening wind, said nothing, and stayed. Maybe it was when a girl, once treated like a thing, learned to bake again for herself. and for others. Or maybe it was simply born from silence, long, deep, and warm enough that no one needed to heal the other, and yet somehow they did, and that was enough. Enough for a story no one told aloud, but that the world still called quietly an Old West story. Just stay, and sometimes that's enough. I don't quite remember what day Eliza arrived, only that the snow had covered the porch up to my boots, and I'd baked an extra loaf just like always. I used to think I needed someone to talk to. Turns out what I really needed was someone who didn't ask anything, someone who swept the kitchen in silence and knew the fire should be started early on days when the wind blew in from the canyon. I didn't save her, and she didn't save me. We just stayed, and sometimes that's enough to keep a person going. And if somehow you see yourself in this story as the girl who once hid her bruises beneath her sleeves, or the old man who still keeps a chair empty at the table, then maybe you already know. No one needs saving with grand gestures or perfect words. Sometimes all it takes is someone quiet enough to stay, right when you've run out of strength to leave. If you want to leave something behind, just write one line. No need to explain. No need to tell it all. Just write, honestly, I stayed. And maybe someone reading that will smile and stay too.